The carriage rattled through the forest like a coffin on wheels, and I suppose that's exactly what it was meant to be. What? I'd been traveling for 3 days through terrain that grew progressively darker, not just in the fading light of dusk but in some fundamental way that had nothing to do with the sun. The trees here didn't grow toward the light, they twisted away from something deeper, something ancient that pulsed beneath the earth like a second heartbeat. My escort, a pair of silent men with faces like carved stone, hadn't spoken a single word since we left the borderlands. They didn't need to. The parchment I carried in my coat pocket said everything that mattered. You are summoned to the court of endless night. Refusal is not an option. Delay will be considered insult. Insult will be considered declaration. The seal at the bottom wasn't wax. It was something darker, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I'd watched it for hours on that first night, wondering if I was looking at dried blood or something far worse. By the second night I'd stopped wondering. Some questions are better left unanswered when you're traveling toward the heart of vampire territory with nothing but a formal invitation and a half-broken sword you barely know how to use. My name is Marcus Renfield and I am, or was, nobody. A clerk in the administrative offices of the Merchant Council of Thornhaven, a city so far removed from anything resembling danger that our biggest controversy in the last decade involved disputed grain tariffs. I pushed papers, I counted coins, I went home to a small apartment that smelled like old books and cheaper wine. I was 28 years old and had already accepted that my life would be a long, quiet decline into comfortable irrelevance. Then the summons arrived. It came to the council offices directly, delivered by a courier who appeared at midnight and vanished before anyone could ask questions. The Lord Chairman himself brought it to my desk the next morning, his hands actually trembling as he held it out. Marcus, he'd said, his voice barely a whisper, I don't know what you've done, but may the old gods have mercy on you. I hadn't done anything. That was the terrifying part. I'd never even seen a vampire, let alone interacted with one. The closest I'd come to the supernatural was reading disputed historical accounts about the Blood Wars, that catastrophic century of conflict that ended 80 years ago with treaties nobody fully understood and borders nobody dared to cross. Until now. The carriage lurched to a stop and I felt my stomach drop. Through the small window, I could see we'd arrived at a courtyard of black stone so polished it looked like we were floating above an abyss. The castle rose before us, and castle was an insufficient word for what I was seeing. It was a monument to Gothic excess, all soaring spires and impossible angles, with windows that glowed with that same deep crimson light I'd seen in the seal. It looked less like a building and more like a crown of thorns thrust up through the earth by something that refused to stay buried. The carriage door opened. Not by my silent escorts, but by itself, swinging wide with a whisper of hinges that sounded almost like breathing. I stepped out into cold that went beyond temperature into something metaphysical. It wasn't just that the air was frigid, it was that warmth seemed like a distant memory, a theoretical concept rather than a physical reality. My breath didn't just fog. It seemed to vanish as though the very atmosphere was consuming it. This way. The first words my escorts had spoken. The voice came from behind me, and I turned to see that the two men had been joined by a dozen others, all wearing the same dark livery, all with the same expressionless faces. But these weren't human. Their eyes caught the red light from the castle windows and threw it back like mirrors. I followed because there was nothing else to do. We crossed the courtyard and entered through doors that must have been 20 feet tall, carved from a single piece of black wood I couldn't identify. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature changed again, not warmer but different. Inside, the cold was alive. It moved around you, curious and hungry. The entrance hall was a cathedral of shadows. Chandeliers hung from a ceiling lost in darkness, their candles burning with that omnipresent red flame. The floor was marble so dark it might as well have been polished obsidian, reflecting distorted versions of everything above it. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there were eyes. Not physical eyes. These were vampires, and they lined the walls in absolute silence, arranged in what I slowly realized was a formation of rank and precedence. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. All perfectly still, all watching me with an intensity that felt like pressure against my skin. I was led down the center of this gauntlet, my footsteps echoing obscenely loud in the silence. Every instinct I had was screaming to look down, to make myself smaller, to show deference to these apex predators who could tear me apart faster than I could blink. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fatalism. I was already dead, so why not die with my chin up? Maybe it was something else, something I didn't have words for yet. But I walked down that hall with my eyes forward, acknowledging their stares without flinching from them. And I felt it, a ripple of reaction moving through them like wind through grass. Surprise? Respect? Interest? I couldn't tell. But something had changed in the quality of their attention. We reached the end of the hall where a pair of even larger doors stood closed. My escorts stopped, and one of them, the one who'd spoken before, finally turned to look at me directly. His eyes were the color of aged burgundy. "You will be taken to the throne of night," he said. "You will speak only if she addresses you directly. You will not raise your voice. You will not make sudden movements. You will not touch anything. You will not." He paused, something almost like concern flickering across his inhuman features. "You will not, under any circumstances, meet her eyes. Do you understand?" "I understand the instructions," I said carefully. "I can't promise I'll be able to follow all of them." Several of the vampires in the hall drew sharp breaths. My escort's eyes widened fractionally. "That," he said slowly, "was perhaps the most honest answer anyone has given in this court in a century. It may save you. Or it may doom you." He turned away. "The old gods alone know which." The doors opened, and I stepped forward into the throne room of the vampire queen. The throne room was not a room. It was a geometry lesson written by someone who'd gone mad studying the spaces between spaces. The ceiling, if there was a ceiling, vanished into a darkness so complete it seemed intentional, as though someone had carefully removed the concept of above from the architecture. The walls curved in ways that hurt to look at directly, lined with alcoves where more vampires stood in perfect stillness, arranged in descending tiers like an amphitheater built for witnessing executions. And at the far end, elevated on a dais of black stone that seemed to drink the light from the red candles, was the throne itself. It wasn't made from any material I could identify. It looked like crystallized night, all sharp angles and smooth curves simultaneously, throwing back twisted reflections that didn't quite match reality. And sitting upon it, so still she might have been carved from the same impossible substance, was her. The vampire queen. I'd expected beauty. The old stories all mentioned the supernatural allure of vampires, their ability to appear as the most desirable thing imaginable to whoever looked upon them. But this wasn't beauty in any way I understood the term. This was beauty as a weapon, beauty as a form of violence committed against the senses. She was tall, I could tell even though she was seated, with skin so pale it seemed to glow from within with its own cold light. Her hair was a cascade of silver black that moved slightly despite the absence of any wind, as though responding to currents visible only to her. Her face was angular and perfect in the way that mathematical proofs are perfect. Undeniable, irrefutable, and somehow terrifying in its absolute correctness. But it was her dress that truly caught my attention. It was black, but not the simple black of cloth. This was the black of deep water at midnight, of the spaces between stars, of the moment before dawn when the world holds its breath. It flowed around her like liquid shadow, cut in a style that managed to be both modest and provocative, revealing and concealing, formal and intimate all at once. Along its surface, patterns seemed to move, runes or symbols in a language I didn't recognize, glowing faintly with that same dark light as the seal on my summons. She wore no crown. She didn't need one. Everything about her presence declared sovereignty with more authority than any physical symbol ever could. I was halfway across the throne room when I realized something that made my heart skip. There were no guards near her. Every other vampire in the vast space stood at a distance, positioned along the walls and in the alcoves. But the area immediately around the throne, a circle perhaps 20 feet in diameter, was completely empty except for her. A queen sitting alone, unguarded, before a court of immortal predators. That was when I knew this wasn't a trial. This was a test. I reached the base of the dais and stopped. The correct protocol I assumed was to kneel. Every fiber of common sense I possessed was screaming at me to drop to my knees, to press my forehead to that cold marble floor, to make myself as small and non-threatening as possible. I didn't kneel. Instead, I stood with my feet shoulder-width apart, my hands at my sides, and I looked up at her. Not at her eyes, I remembered that warning clearly, but at her face, acknowledging her presence as one conscious being to another. The silence in the throne room somehow became even more profound. I heard nothing, not even breathing. Vampires don't need to breathe except to speak, I remembered. They were all holding perfectly still, waiting to see what would happen to the human foolish enough to stand before their queen without groveling. Marcus Renfield. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the entire space, resonating in a way that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. It was a voice like dark honey over razors, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Clerk of Thornhaven. Son of merchants. Grandson of farmers. Unremarkable in every particular. She paused. Until tonight. Your Majesty, I said, and was surprised to find my voice steady. I don't know why I'm here. No, she agreed. You don't. Neither do they. She made a small gesture that somehow encompassed the entire assembled court. Neither did I until I saw you walk through those doors. She leaned forward slightly, and the movement sent ripples through the assembled vampires like a stone dropped in still water. You were told not to meet my eyes, weren't you? Yes, Your Majesty. Do you know why? I thought about it. I assume it's either a form of compulsion, that you can control those who look directly at you, or it's simply a matter of protocol. Perhaps both. Both, she confirmed. And yet you look at my face. You acknowledge me as present without pretending I don't exist. You stand before me without kneeling, which is either breathtaking arrogance or remarkable courage. Which is it, Marcus Renfield? Probably neither, Your Majesty. Probably just ignorance. I don't know the rules well enough to break them intentionally, so I'm just being myself. It's all I know how to do. Another ripple through the court. Somewhere in the shadows, a vampire laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. The queen tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that felt like being dissected. Would you like to know why you were summoned? Very much, Your Majesty. Because of a prophecy. She said it without drama, as a simple statement of fact. A very old prophecy made before the blood wars, before the treaties, before vampires and humans learned to live in our separate arrangements. A prophecy that said when the Court of Knights stood at a crossroads, when ancient decisions would need to be unmade and new paths chosen, a human would come who could see us as we are. Not as monsters. Not as myths. But as we truly are. She stood, and the movement was so fluid it barely seemed like movement at all. More like she had always been standing and I was only now noticing it. Every decade we cast out our nets into the human world, looking for this prophesied individual. We search through your populations for someone who might be the one foretold. We send summons to hundreds, thousands. Over the years, over the centuries, we have brought countless humans here to test them. She descended the steps of the dais, and I realized with a jolt that she was walking toward me. Directly toward me. Every vampire in the room tensed, a collective drawing in that I felt rather than saw. They all failed, she continued, still approaching. They either broke under the fear, groveling and begging. Or they postured with false bravery, pretending not to be terrified while reeking of terror. Or they came with weapons and hatred, which was at least honest but still wrong. Do you know what none of them did? She stopped directly in front of me. Close enough that I could smell her, and she did smell, not of death or blood or decay, but of night-blooming flowers and old paper and something else I couldn't identify. Something that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum of sense. None of them, she said softly, simply stood there and admitted they didn't know what to do. Your Majesty, I said, and had to clear my throat because it had suddenly gone dry, I still don't understand what this prophecy means. What am I supposed to see? She smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. Her teeth were very white, and yes, her canines were slightly longer than human normal, but not grotesquely so. Just enough to remind you that she was fundamentally different, built on a blueprint that had been revised by forces that didn't care about your comfort or survival. Walk with me, she said, and turned without waiting for my response. I followed because, again, what else was I going to do? She led me not deeper into the throne room but to the side, toward one of the alcoves where vampires stood watching. As we approached, they parted smoothly, creating a gap that revealed a doorway I hadn't noticed before. We passed through it into a corridor lined with windows. Except they weren't windows showing the outside. They were windows showing memories? Moments? I saw battles frozen in glass, negotiations around tables that looked like altars, executions and coronations, and quiet moments of tenderness between creatures that should have been incapable of tenderness. Each window was a snapshot from history, and we walked past centuries of them without the Queen pausing or explaining. "Do you know what vampires are, Marcus?" she asked as we walked. "Predators," I said. "Immortal or near enough. Created by a curse or a blessing depending on which historian you ask. Nocturnal. Blood drinkers. Stronger and faster than humans. Capable of compulsion and other supernatural abilities that vary by bloodline and age." "All true," she acknowledged. "All surface. But do you know what we are beneath that? Do you know what we have to be in order to survive for centuries without going mad?" I thought about it. Careful. She stopped walking and turned to face me, and something in her expression had changed. The mask of regal authority had cracked just slightly, and through the crack I saw something that looked almost like exhaustion. "Frozen," she said. "We have to be frozen, Marcus. Unchanging. Because change when you are immortal is death. Not physical death, we're very difficult to kill, but death of self. If you change who you are every decade, every century, then after 1,000 years what remains? The curse that made us also gave us rigidity. We can hold positions, maintain beliefs, sustain hatreds and loves across ages that would crush human memory. But we cannot easily adapt. We cannot easily learn. We cannot easily see things in new ways." She gestured around us at the memory windows. "Everything you see here, all of this history, it is the result of vampires making decisions and then being utterly unable to remake them. The blood wars happened because a dispute over territory became locked into place, became identity, became unquestionable truth. And we slaughtered each other and you humans for 100 years over something that stopped mattering within the first decade. The treaties ended the wars," I said carefully. "The treaties were an external force strong enough to override our internal rigidity," she corrected. "The combined armies of 12 human kingdoms and the intervention of magic users we no longer have access to, that was enough to break the deadlock. But the underlying problem never went away. We are still frozen. We are still locked into patterns set centuries ago. And the world has changed around us while we remain the same." We had reached the end of the corridor. Here, instead of another window, there was a door of dark wood. She opened it, revealing a room beyond. It was surprisingly simple. A study with shelves of books lining the walls, a desk near a fireplace where real flames, orange and yellow, not red, burned cheerfully. There were even a few comfortable-looking chairs arranged near the fire. It looked like a place where someone might actually live rather than merely reign. "This is my private chamber," she said, stepping inside. "No one else enters here without explicit permission. Not my advisors, not my generals, not my—" she paused. "Not anyone. I am bringing you here because I need you to understand the enormity of what I'm about to propose." She sat in one of the chairs by the fireplace and, in a gesture that made my heart stop, gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit." It was not a request. It was not an order. It was something between the two, an invitation that carried the weight of command but the form of courtesy. I sat. We were now in a private room, alone, queen and clerk, vampire and human, with no guards and no witnesses. She was close enough that I could have reached out and touched her. Not that I would, not that I'd survive doing so, but the physical possibility existed. This was either the highest honor imaginable or the most elaborate prelude to murder in history. "The prophecy," she said, settling back into her chair with a grace that made the simple act look choreographed, "speaks of a human who can see vampires as they truly are. Not monsters, not myths, but people locked in time. People who need help changing. The prophecy says this human will sit with the queen without guards between them, and in that vulnerability, a new path will become visible." She looked at me directly then, and I realized with a shock that I was meeting her eyes. Not intentionally, it had just happened naturally, the way you look at someone when they're speaking to you. And the moment our gazes locked, I understood why the warning had been given. Her eyes were crimson, yes, but not the crimson of blood. They were the crimson of dying stars, of autumn leaves, of the last light before full dark. And they held a depth that made me dizzy, centuries of experience, of memory, of existence compressed into a gaze that saw through you and into you and past you all at once. I should have looked away. I couldn't. There it is, she whispered. You're doing the thing they all feared. You're looking at me. You're seeing me. And you're not being compelled because I'm not compelling you. I'm not even trying. You're just looking. Because you're curious. Because you want to understand. My voice came out hoarse. I do want to understand. Why does that matter? Because curiosity is the engine of change, she said. And we have forgotten how to be curious. We have forgotten how to ask questions we don't already know the answers to. We have forgotten how to be vulnerable enough to admit we might be wrong about something. She leaned forward. You walked into my court and admitted you didn't know the rules. Do you know how long it's been since anyone in that throne room admitted ignorance about anything? Centuries, Marcus. Literally centuries. We have built our entire civilization on the pretense of omniscience, and it is killing us by inches. What do you need from me? I asked. I need you, she said slowly as though tasting each word, to sit with me. Here, in this room without guards or protocols or pretenses. I need you to ask me questions. I need you to challenge my assumptions. I need you to be the thing that vampires cannot be to each other. I need you to be honest about not knowing. And through your questions, your uncertainty, your very human confusion. I need to find a way to change my mind about something I have believed for 700 years. What do you believe? Her smile was sad. That vampires and humans can never coexist as equals. That the treaties were a temporary measure, a holding pattern until we figure out how to assert dominance again or how to disappear entirely. That we are fundamentally incompatible, and the only reason we haven't gone back to war is that we're all too exhausted to start fighting again. She stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. But there are those in my court who believe the time for holding patterns is over. Who believe we need to choose, dominance or extinction, conquest or fade away. They are gathering support. They are calling for a new war, a final war, one that will establish vampire supremacy permanently or eradicate us trying. And she turned to face me. I cannot convince them otherwise. Because I don't believe otherwise. I believe the same thing they do. I just want to delay the inevitable a bit longer because I am tired of war. But I cannot say that. A queen cannot admit exhaustion. A queen cannot admit doubt. But you're admitting it to me, I pointed out. Yes, she said. Because you are human. Because you will be dust before your opinion of me matters in the long scheme of my existence. Because you are powerless and insignificant and utterly, completely harmless to my reign. She moved closer. And because the prophecy said that in this vulnerability, in sitting with you, in speaking honestly with you, I would see a new path. So I am fulfilling the prophecy's conditions in the hope that it is true and not simply the fever dream of a long-dead oracle. I sat there processing this. A vampire queen, perhaps the most powerful supernatural creature on the continent, had just told me that she was fulfilling a prophecy out of desperation, admitting to exhaustion and doubt, and essentially asking me, a clerk from a nothing city, to somehow help her change her entire worldview. Your Majesty, I said carefully, I think you might have summoned the wrong human. She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised and delighted, and it transformed her face entirely. For just a moment she looked young, not in years but in spirit. Oh, Marcus, she said, sitting back down across from me. I think you might be exactly the right one. We talked through the night. I don't mean that metaphorically. We literally talked as the hours passed and the world outside those windows cycled through its darkest hours. The queen had servants bring refreshments. Wine for me, excellent wine, better than anything I'd tasted in my entire life, and nothing for her. She didn't drink or eat while I was there, and I found myself grateful for that small mercy. Watching her feed would have been complicated. She asked me about my life and I told her. I described Thornhaven, my little apartment, my work at the Merchant Council. I told her about my parents who died when I was young in a bridge collapse that was probably someone's fault but no one was ever held accountable. I told her about my education at a middling academy where I'd learned enough to be useful but not enough to be remarkable. I told her about my few friends, my fewer romantic interests, my complete lack of ambition beyond basic comfort. You're describing a life of profound ordinariness, she observed, but not cruelly. You're aware of that? Painfully aware, I confirmed. though I wouldn't have used the word profound to describe it until just now. Ordinariness is undervalued, she said. Immortals especially forget its worth. When you have centuries, the ordinary becomes intolerable. You seek novelty, intensity, extremes. You forget that most life, most real life, happens in the quiet spaces between dramatic moments. Is that what you've forgotten? I asked. The value of the ordinary? She considered this. Perhaps. We remember the blood wars vividly, every battle, every betrayal, every triumph. But we don't remember the centuries before them. They were ordinary. Vampires and humans living in proximity, trading, occasionally intermarrying through complex rituals that temporarily bridged our natures. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. It was boring. She smiled slightly. And none of us thought it was worth preserving because it wasn't grand or epic or memorable. But you went back to it after the wars, I pointed out. The treaties re-established separation, not cooperation, but at least there's peace. A peace based on avoidance, she countered. We stay in our territories, you stay in yours, and we pretend the other doesn't exist except for carefully controlled diplomatic contacts. It's not coexistence. It's parallel existence. And it cannot last. Why not? Because the world is shrinking. She stood and went to one of the bookshelves, pulling down what looked like a map. She unrolled it on a nearby table and I joined her to look. It showed the continent, vampire territories in black, human kingdoms in white, with gray areas marking the neutral zones and disputed territories. When this map was drawn 80 years ago at the end of the wars, there was space for both of us, she explained. These gray areas were buffer zones, places where neither side claimed dominance. But look at this. She pulled out another map, clearly more recent. The gray areas had shrunk noticeably. Human populations are growing. Your cities are expanding. You're pushing into the buffer zones not out of aggression but out of simple necessity. You need room for your growing numbers. She pulled out a third map, and this one was marked with her own notations. And vampire territories are shrinking not because you're pushing us out but because we're failing. Without new vampires being created, and creation has been forbidden by our own laws since the wars ended, our numbers dwindle. We die in accidents, in duels, in the rare cases where hunters get lucky. Slowly, so slowly we are fading. In another 2 centuries, maybe 3, there will be too few of us to maintain our territories. The younger vampires see this. They want to expand, to secure our borders, to create new vampires and build our numbers back to wartime levels. That would break the treaties, I said. Yes. And breaking the treaties means war. Which means another century of slaughter if we're lucky. If we're not lucky, it means the complete eradication of one species or the other. She looked at me. So when I say this cannot last, I mean it literally. The current arrangement has perhaps 50 years left before it collapses. And I have spent the last decade trying to figure out what comes after, and I have failed. I studied the maps, tracing the shrinking gray zones with my finger. You need a third option. Obviously. I'm not an idiot, Marcus, I'm just frozen. I can see that the current path leads to disaster. I can see that war would be catastrophic. But I cannot see an alternative. My mind literally cannot conceive of what a different arrangement would look like. I've tried. I've spent years trying. And all I can imagine is variations on domination or avoidance. What about integration? I asked. She blinked. What? Integration. Humans and vampires sharing territories, sharing cities, sharing space. Actually coexisting instead of just existing near each other. The look she gave me was somewhere between fascination and horror. That would require trust, I finished. Yeah, a lot of trust. Probably more trust than currently exists in the entire world. I looked at the maps again. But here's the thing, avoidance is failing and domination leads to war. Integration is the only option that isn't those two things. Which means it's worth at least considering even if it seems impossible. It's not just impossible, she said. It's unthinkable. Vampires cannot share territory with humans on equal terms. We are predators. You are prey. The power imbalance is fundamental to our biology. Is it? I asked. Or is it fundamental to your culture? Because there's a difference. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Closed it. Opened it again. I don't know how to answer that. That's okay, I said. Neither do I. But you asked me to be curious with you, to ask questions you don't know the answers to. So here's a question. What if the predator-prey relationship is cultural, not biological? What if it's something that can be changed? If that were true, she said slowly, then everything we believe about ourselves would be wrong. Our entire civilization is built on the assumption that we are apex predators, that our relationship to humanity is inherently hierarchical. Maybe it is, I said. But maybe it doesn't have to be. Humans were apex predators once too. We hunted megafauna to extinction, we dominated entire continents. But we learned to be domesticators, farmers, cooperators. We changed our relationship to the world around us. Not easily and not without cost, but we did it. You're suggesting vampires could learn to be farmers? She sounded almost amused. I'm suggesting vampires could learn to be partners. Not equals in the sense of having identical capabilities, you're clearly stronger, faster, longer lived. But equals in the sense of having equal stake in a shared future. She walked back to her chair and sat down heavily. The younger vampires would call that submission. They would say I was advocating for surrender to humanity. Then don't start with them, I said. Start with the humans. Start with cooperation on a small scale, something low stakes where failure doesn't mean war. Prove that integration can work before you try to implement it broadly. Like what? I thought about it. Trade? Not the formal diplomatic trade that already exists, but actual integrated markets. Vampire craftsmen selling directly to human customers and vice versa. It would require mixing populations, at least in border cities, but in controlled ways. With rules, safeguards, maybe even human volunteers who are willing to provide blood in exchange for, I don't know, payment? Services? There has to be a way to handle the feeding issue that doesn't involve predation. She stared at me. You're describing prostitution. I'm describing a regulated market for a necessary resource, I corrected. Humans already sell their labor, their time, their expertise. Why not their blood if they're fairly compensated and protected? It removes the predation element entirely, or at least reduces it to a consensual transaction. That is, she trailed off, that is actually a coherent proposal. Horrifying to vampire traditionalists, probably offensive to human moralists, but coherent. Would it work? I have no idea. But it's not war and it's not avoidance, so it's already more creative than anything my advisors have suggested. She leaned back. Do you know what's happening right now, Marcus? Right now in this conversation? You're considering a new option? I'm changing my mind, she said, and her voice held something like wonder. For the first time in 700 years, I am actually changing my position on something fundamental. I came into this conversation believing that war was inevitable, that it was just a matter of when. And now, I'm not certain. I'm actually uncertain. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? I didn't, not really. I changed my mind about things a dozen times just that day, whether to be terrified or fatalistic, whether she was going to kill me or recruit me, whether this prophecy was real or elaborate justification for something else entirely. Changing your mind seemed like the most normal thing in the world. But for her, it was revolutionary. The prophecy, I said. It was true. It would appear so. She looked at me with those crimson eyes, and now that I'd gotten used to them, I could see the person behind them. Someone ancient and powerful, yes, but also someone tired, someone who'd been carrying impossible weight for centuries and had just discovered she might be allowed to set it down. What happens now? I asked. Now, she said, the truly difficult part. I have to convince my court. She didn't bring me back to the throne room that night. Instead, she had servants, human servants, I realized with surprise, prepare chambers for me. Not a cell, not a cage, but actual guest quarters with a bed that was far too comfortable and windows that showed the castle grounds in the cold light of pre-dawn. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was racing with everything that had happened, everything that had been said. A few hours ago, I'd been a clerk with no ambitions beyond maybe getting a raise next year. Now I was apparently the catalyst for a fundamental shift in vampire society. Possibly. If the queen could convince her court to listen. And that was a very big if. A servant brought me breakfast, actual food, which I devoured with embarrassing enthusiasm. Then came clothes because apparently my travel-worn clerk's outfit wasn't suitable for court. The servant laid out garments that were simpler than the elaborate costumes I'd seen on the vampires, but still far finer than anything I'd worn before. Black trousers, a white shirt with subtle embroidery, a coat that was midnight blue and fit perfectly despite no one having measured me. "The Queen sees truly," the servant said when I commented on the fit. He was an older human, maybe 60, with kind eyes. "She looked at you once and knew your exact dimensions. It's a small gift but a useful one." "How long have you been here?" I asked. 30 years, he said. "I came as a young man seeking employment. I stay because the pay is extraordinary and the work is easier than farming." "You're not afraid?" He smiled. "Fear fades with familiarity, young master. The vampires are dangerous, yes, but no more so than human nobles and considerably more honest about their natures. I've lived a good life here." It was a perspective I hadn't considered, that humans might actually choose this life, might prefer service in a vampire court to the alternatives available in human society. It added another dimension to the integration question. When I was dressed, a vampire escort arrived, not the ones from my journey but a new individual. Female, young-looking with the bearing of a professional. "The Queen has called a special session of the court," she informed me. "You are to attend. Stay close to me, speak only if addressed directly by Her Majesty, and whatever you do, do not show fear. They will exploit it." "Reassuring," I muttered. She smiled, showing teeth. "I like you, human. You have spirit. Try to keep it even if they test you." We walked through corridors I hadn't seen before, passing windows that showed the castle grounds in daylight. The sun was up, I realized. It must be late morning. But the vampires were still active. The myths about them being destroyed by sunlight were apparently exaggerated, or perhaps only applied to younger vampires. I filed that away as another question to ask if I survived the coming session. We entered the throne room through a side door and I saw it was already filled. But the configuration had changed. The throne remained on its dais, but now there were additional seats arranged in a semicircle facing it, high-backed chairs of dark wood, each occupied by a vampire who radiated power like heat from a forge. These were the elders, I realized. The true aristocracy of the court. The Queen was already seated on her throne, and when we entered, her eyes found me immediately. She nodded slightly, acknowledgement, perhaps, or encouragement. My escort led me to a position standing to one side, not quite among the elders but not relegated to the back with the lesser nobility. It was a deliberate placement, I understood, visible but not threatening, present but not presumptuous. The Queen stood, and every vampire in the room immediately fell silent. "We gather," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly, "to discuss the future of our people. The choice that approaches. The necessity of decision." She paused. "I have recently received counsel that I wish to share with you. Counsel from an unexpected source, but one that the ancient prophecies foretold." A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled vampires. They'd heard about the prophecy clearly, but perhaps hadn't expected it to be invoked so directly. "Last night," the Queen continued, "I sat without guards with the human Marcus Renfield. I spoke with him of our dilemma, the coming collapse of the treaty system, the choice between war and fading. And through that conversation, I have reconsidered positions I have held for centuries." Now the reaction was stronger. Vampires turning to look at each other, at me, at the Queen with expressions of shock and, in some cases, anger. One of the elders stood. He was ancient, even by vampire standards, skin like parchment stretched over elegant bones, eyes that glowed with dark fire. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice like wind over gravestones, "you cannot mean to suggest that a human clerk has influenced your judgment on matters of state." "I mean to suggest exactly that, Lord Corvinus," she replied, "because his perspective is unclouded by our rigidity. He can see options that we cannot because he has not spent centuries locked into existing patterns." "He is prey," another elder said, standing. This one was female, beautiful and terrible, wearing crimson that matched her eyes. "He cannot understand our nature. He cannot speak to our needs. Whatever counsel he offers is fundamentally flawed by his limited understanding of what we are." "Is it?" the Queen asked. "Or is our understanding of what we are the thing that is limited?" Lord Corvinus, Lady Sable, honored elders, you have lived through the blood wars. You remember the cost of our rigidity, our inability to adapt when the world changed around us. And now the world is changing again, and you propose that we respond with the same inflexibility that brought us to the brink of destruction last time. We propose that we secure our survival, Lord Corvinus said coldly, by whatever means necessary. If that requires war, then so be it. We did not claw our way through the wars only to fade quietly into history because we were too timid to assert ourselves. Asserting ourselves is not the same as repeating failed strategies, the Queen countered. The human has proposed an alternative. Integration. Shared territories. Cooperative rather than competitive existence. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Vampires standing, shouting, the careful decorum of the court evaporating in a wave of outrage. I heard words like surrender, and weakness, and betrayal, all directed at the Queen with a vehemence that made me take an involuntary step backward. My escort put a hand on my shoulder. Stand firm, she whispered. Show no fear. The Queen raised one hand and silence crashed down like a physical force. The sheer presence of her will was staggering. Every vampire in the room froze, not by compulsion but by pure respect for her authority. I expected this reaction, she said quietly, because I had the same reaction initially. The proposal sounds like submission to those of us who have spent millennia as apex predators. But consider, what if predation is not the only relationship available to us? What if partnership offers something that dominance cannot? What could humans possibly offer us that we cannot take? Lady Sable demanded. The Queen smiled. Adaptability. Innovation. The very changeability that we see as weakness is actually their greatest strength. Humans can change who they are, what they believe, how they organize themselves in response to new information. We cannot. We are locked into patterns set centuries ago. But if we partner with humans, if we create genuine integration, then their adaptability becomes available to us through them. You're suggesting we should become dependent on humans? Lord Corvinus said, his voice dripping with disdain. I'm suggesting we should recognize that we already are dependent on them, the Queen replied. We feed on their blood. We have spent centuries pretending this makes us superior, but it actually makes us fundamentally reliant on their continued existence and proximity. The treaties work not because we graciously allow them to work, but because we need humans to survive. Integration simply acknowledges that reality and builds a system around it that benefits both species. There was a long silence. Then a new vampire stood, younger than the elders I thought, but still radiating power. Your Majesty, even if we accepted this integration, how would it work practically? The feeding issue alone is insurmountable. We are killers by nature. Are we? The Queen asked. Or are we killers by habit? By cultural expectation? When was the last time any of you actually needed to kill to feed? We have had methods of non-lethal feeding for centuries. We choose not to use them because we enjoy the hunt, the power, the fear. But that is choice, not necessity. She turned to look at me directly. The human has proposed a regulated system. Voluntary blood donation in exchange for compensation. It removes the predation entirely, transforms feeding from an act of violence to a consensual transaction. You would have us pay for our food? Lady Sable said incredulously. Humans pay for their food, I said, and immediately regretted speaking because every vampire eye in the room swiveled toward me. But I'd started, so I continued. You already pay for many things, resources, services, art. Why is blood different? Because you've traditionally taken it by force? That's not an argument for continuing the practice. That's just description of current behavior. You dare lecture us? Lord Corvinus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I dare answer a question, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Lady Sable asked why you should pay for blood. I'm suggesting that the question itself reveals the problem. You're assuming access to human blood is your right rather than a privilege that should be negotiated. That assumption is what prevents you from seeing integration as viable. The Queen stood and descended from her throne, walking across the floor until she stood beside me. Not in front of me, beside me. A physical declaration of partnership that sent another wave of shock through the court. The human speaks truth, she said. Uncomfortable truth, but truth nonetheless. We have built our civilization on assumptions that are no longer serving us. Lord Corvinus, Lady Sable, honored elders, I am not proposing we accept these changes immediately. I am proposing we test them. A pilot program in a single border city. Limited integration with strict rules and safeguards. If it fails, we lose nothing except the time invested. If it succeeds, she paused. If it succeeds, we may have found a path that is neither war nor fading. And if it succeeds, Lord Corvinus said coldly, we will have demonstrated to the younger vampires that submission is the path forward. We will have shown weakness. And they will tear this court apart. Then they will tear it apart anyway, the Queen said. Because the status quo is not sustainable. You know this as well as I do. The question is not whether we change, but whether we change on our terms or have change forced upon us by circumstance. I prefer the former. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. I could feel the weight of centuries of history, tradition, and ingrained belief pressing down on this moment. The Queen had made her argument, had invoked prophecy and logic and necessity. But would it be enough? Finally, an elder who hadn't yet spoken stood. He was somewhere between Corvinus and Sable in apparent age, with silver hair and eyes like polished steel. A test, he said slowly. 1 city. 1 year. Strict oversight. And if it fails, when it fails, we proceed with territorial expansion as originally planned. When it fails, the Queen asked. Your Majesty, he said with something almost like sympathy, I respect your willingness to explore alternatives. But integration of predator and prey species in equal partnership has never succeeded in the history of the world. Not with any species. I will support your test because I respect the prophecy in your judgment, but I do not believe it will succeed. And I want it on record that when we proceed to the expansion plan, it will be with the knowledge that we explored other options first. Noted, Lord Ashford, the Queen said. She looked around the room. Are there others who will support this test? Hands rose. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough. Slowly, reluctantly, enough elders stood in support that the proposal had backing. Then it is decided, the Queen said. We will implement a pilot program of vampire-human integration in the border city of Thornhaven. My head snapped around to stare at her. Thornhaven? My city? She met my eyes and smiled slightly. Did you think I chose you randomly, Marcus Renfield? Your city is perfectly positioned, small enough to manage, large enough to matter, with an existing population that has limited contact with vampires but not active hostility. And you know it intimately. You will serve as liaison, working with both the Human City Council and the vampire representatives I will assign. Your Majesty, I'm a clerk. You were a clerk, she corrected. Now you are the human who sat beside the vampire queen and changed her mind. Now you are the instrument of prophecy. Now you are the bridge between species. She turned back to the assembled court. We will establish the framework within the month. Lord Ashford, Lord Corvinus, Lady Sable, I want you on the oversight committee. If this fails, I want it to fail with our best efforts behind it, not because we sabotaged it through incompetence. As your Majesty commands, they replied in unison, though Corvinus looked like he was biting back additional commentary. The court session ended shortly after, vampires filing out in groups, already arguing about the decision in low, intense voices. My escort retrieved me and led me out through the side door again. That, she said once we were in the corridor, was the most extraordinary court session I've witnessed in 50 years. You should feel very proud or very terrified. Possibly both. Definitely both, I confirmed. The Queen will want to speak with you again before you leave. But for now I'm to show you more of the castle. She wants you to understand what we are beyond the throne room and the formal spaces. She smiled. She wants you to see us as people. I think that's actually the point of this entire exercise. My escort, who finally introduced herself as Elena, took me through parts of the castle I hadn't imagined existed. We moved away from the formal spaces, the throne rooms and halls of state, into areas that felt almost domestic. We passed a library that could have housed the entire collection of Thornhaven's archives 3 times over. Vampires sat at tables reading, taking notes, debating in quiet voices. It looked like any university study hall, except the students were immortal and the books were often bound in materials I didn't want to examine too closely. We passed workshops where vampire craftsmen created art of breathtaking beauty, sculptures that seemed to capture motion in stone, paintings that hurt to look at directly because they were too vivid, too real. We have infinite time to perfect techniques, Elena explained. A human master might spend 50 years achieving greatness. We spend 500. The results are proportionally magnificent. We passed living quarters and through open doors, I glimpsed spaces that were surprisingly ordinary. Vampires sleeping in beds. They did sleep, apparently, though less than humans, reading, playing musical instruments, arguing about dishes left unwashed. They were people. Immortal, powerful, dangerous people, but people nonetheless. You're trying to make me see you as more than monsters, I said. Yes, Elena agreed. Because you're going to be the voice explaining us to your fellow humans, and if you only understand us through formal interactions and throne room politics, you'll explain us wrong. We are more than our power. We are more than our hunger. We are, she paused, searching for words. We are people who have been alive too long, who remember too much, who carry too many histories. That makes us dangerous, yes. But it also makes us capable of things humans aren't. Like what? Like keeping promises across centuries. Like maintaining traditions through historical upheavals that would shatter human societies. Like valuing things that transcend individual lifetimes. Art, knowledge, careful planning for futures so distant they're almost abstractions. She turned to look at me. Humans are good at adapting, at changing, at surviving in the moment. But you're terrible at long-term thinking. You can't conceptualize what 50 years means, let alone 500. We can. That's not superiority, it's different capacity. And if we could combine human adaptability with vampire patience, you'd have something neither species can achieve alone, I finished. Exactly. That's what the Queen is betting on. That the combination is more valuable than either species in isolation. We ended up in what Elena called the memory hall, a long corridor lined with portraits. But these weren't normal paintings. As we walked past, the figures in the portraits moved, turned to watch us, some even spoke. Preserved moments, Elena explained. Not just images but echoes of the individuals themselves, captured through magic we no longer fully understand. These are the queens and kings who ruled before Her Majesty. Centuries of monarchs, all watching, all weighing in on decisions through their preserved wisdom. We stopped before one portrait. A male vampire with features that were simultaneously beautiful and severe. He wore armor that looked functional rather than ceremonial, and his eyes followed me with uncomfortable intensity. King Malachi the Unbreakable, Elena said. He ruled during the Blood Wars. He was not kind. Is he going to offer commentary? I asked nervously. The portrait smiled. The human has spine, it said, its voice somehow coming from the painting itself. I like that. In my time we would have tested you in blood. Made you fight for the right to speak. Your queen is more merciful than I was. The painted figure leaned forward slightly. But mercy has its cost. Remember that, human. What you're proposing requires strength, not just idealism. Integration will be challenged, sabotaged, tested by those who want it to fail. Are you strong enough to defend it? I don't know, I admitted. I'm a clerk. I'm not a fighter or a leader or any of the things this role probably requires. Honesty again, the portrait mused. You keep offering honesty when pretty lies would serve you better. That's either wisdom or foolishness and I cannot tell which. He leaned back. But the prophecy chose you and prophecies are rarely wrong, merely misunderstood. Perhaps being a clerk is exactly what's needed. Someone who understands systems, who can document and organize and create frameworks. Someone who makes grand ideas function in mundane reality. Another portrait, this one female, spoke up. The prophecy says the human will sit with the queen without guards. As happened. But it also says that in this vulnerability, a new path becomes visible. Has that happened, boy? I think so, I said. At least, the queen says her mind has changed. Changed how? Pressed the portrait. She's considering integration when before she saw only war or fading. She's willing to test partnership where before she saw only predation or avoidance. The portraits exchanged looks, or at least the echoes within them seemed to communicate somehow. Finally, an older portrait, barely visible in the dim light, spoke in a voice like wind through dead leaves. The last time a vampire queen changed her mind on fundamental policy was 400 years ago. It led to the treaties that ended the blood wars. The cost was nearly our extinction, but the alternative was total extinction. The ancient voice paused. If this queen has truly changed her mind, then the prophecy is more powerful than we understood. The human is more significant than he appears. And the coming test will determine not just the fate of one border city, but the future of both species. No pressure, I muttered. Elena laughed and pulled me away from the portraits. Come on. One more place I want to show you before you meet with the queen again. We climbed stairs, lots of stairs, until we emerged onto a balcony high in one of the castle's towers. The sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and purples, and from here I could see for miles. The castle grounds, the dark forest beyond, and in the distance, hints of the border territories where vampire lands met human kingdoms. This is where the young vampires come, Elena said quietly. The ones who were created in the last century who don't remember the blood wars firsthand. They come here and look toward human territories and wonder what it would be like to cross those borders not as invaders or diplomats, but as equals. As partners. You're one of them, I guessed. I was created 60 years ago, she confirmed. I have no memory of the wars, only the stories. And the stories? She trailed off. The stories are cautionary tales told by traumatized elders who can't imagine peace because they've seen too much war. But we younger ones, we've only known the treaties. We've only known this separated existence. And many of us wonder if there could be more. Is that why you support the Queen's plan? I support it because the alternative is returning to war, and I don't want to spend the next century killing and being killed over territory disputes that don't actually matter. I want, she gestured at the sunset, the vast landscape. I want to see what's out there. I want to meet humans not as prey or enemies but as individuals. I want to learn things that aren't about survival or dominance. I want to exist for reasons beyond just continuing to exist. That's very human of you, I said. She smiled. Maybe that's the point. Maybe vampires and humans aren't as different as we pretend. Maybe the gulf between us is cultural, not biological. And maybe your clerk's understanding of systems can help us build a bridge across that gulf. We stood in silence, watching the sun finish its descent. The sky darkened and stars began to appear. Real stars, not the red-lit artificial sky of the throne room. Looking at them, I felt the weight of what was coming settle onto my shoulders. I was going back to Thornhaven, my ordinary little city, and I was bringing with me the seeds of revolution. Vampire integration. Systematic cooperation between species that had spent a century at war and 80 years avoiding each other. It would fail, probably. Lord Ashford was right. Predator and prey species didn't form equal partnerships in nature. But we weren't in nature. We were in civilization. And civilization was the art of making things work that nature said shouldn't. Elena, I said slowly, when you were created, when you were transformed from human to vampire, did you feel like you died? She considered the question. Not died. Changed. Fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The human I was ended, but what replaced her wasn't nothing. It was something new. Something that remembered being human but could never go back. That's what integration will feel like, I said. For both species. Not death but transformation. Neither side will be able to go back to what they were before. The question is whether what replaces the old ways is better or worse. And you think you can make it better? I think I have to try. Because the prophecy chose me, and the Queen believes in me, and everyone else is too frozen in their patterns to attempt it. So it falls to the clerk from nowhere. I laughed without humor. The universe has a terrible sense of irony. Or a perfect one, Elena suggested. Maybe it takes someone from nowhere to go somewhere new. Someone with nothing to lose because they never had much to begin with. A bell rang from somewhere deep in the castle, a sound like deep thunder rolling through stone. The Queen summons you, Elena said. Final meeting before you depart. Are you ready? Absolutely not, I said. Good. That's the right attitude. She led me back toward the stairs. Marcus, whatever happens, whether this integration works or fails, whether you're celebrated or blamed, know that you've already accomplished something remarkable. You've made an immortal change her mind. That's not nothing. The Queen was waiting in her private study again, the room with the warm fireplace and comfortable chairs. But this time she wasn't alone. 3 other vampires were present: Lord Ashford, who'd spoken in support of the test, and 2 others I didn't recognize. Marcus, the Queen greeted me. These are the representatives who will accompany you to Thornhaven. Lord Ashford you've met. This is Lady Miriam, who specializes in human-vampire relations and has maintained diplomatic contacts throughout the treaty period. And this is Vincent, who is young by our standards but has extensive experience with trade negotiations. I nodded to each of them. Lady Miriam was elegant and appeared middle-aged by human standards, with kind eyes that somehow didn't contradict the predatory grace of her movements. Vincent looked barely 30, with an easy smile that probably put humans at ease before they remembered what he was. We've been discussing implementation, the Queen continued, gesturing for me to sit. The logistics of integration are complex. We need to establish frameworks for housing, feeding, legal jurisdiction, dispute resolution, and a dozen other systems. Lord Ashford suggests we start with a small vampire population, no more than 20 individuals initially, living in a designated district within Thornhaven. The human quarter, I said automatically. The old merchant district near the docks. It's been declining for years, lots of empty buildings, but the infrastructure is solid. And it's relatively self-contained, which would make establishing boundaries easier. See, Vincent said, looking at the others. He immediately thinks in terms of practical implementation. This is why we need him. The feeding question remains problematic, Lord Ashford said, looking at me directly. Your proposal of paid blood donation is theoretically sound, but humans are not accustomed to thinking of their blood as a commodity. There will be resistance, perhaps revulsion. Then we start with volunteers, I said. People who are willing to try it, probably for significant compensation initially. Once it becomes normalized, once people see it's safe and beneficial, adoption will increase. That's how most social changes work. Early adopters, then gradual mainstream acceptance. And if we cannot find volunteers? Lady Miriam asked gently. Then we've learned something important. That humans aren't ready for integration and we need to try different approaches. But I don't think that'll be the case. Thornhaven has poverty. It has people struggling to make ends meet. Offering them stable, well-paid work that doesn't require manual labor? Some will accept. They'll be selling their bodies, Lord Ashford said flatly. Make no mistake about what you're proposing. They'll be selling their blood, I corrected. Which humans do already in medical contexts. This is just a different recipient. And unlike other forms of selling your body, manual labor, soldiering, actual prostitution, this is relatively safe and controlled. We'd establish strict medical protocols, limits on frequency, health monitoring. You've thought about this, the Queen observed. I haven't stopped thinking about it since our first conversation, I admitted. If this is going to work, it needs to be systematic, documented, regulated. That's what I'm good at. Creating systems that function. Then create one, she said. I'm giving you full authority to design the implementation framework for Thornhaven. Lord Ashford and his team will review for vampire concerns, but the initial design is yours. The weight of that statement nearly knocked me out of my chair. Full authority? I was a clerk. I'd never designed anything more complex than a filing system. But I'd said I would try, and the Queen was calling my bluff? Or trusting my abilities? Possibly both. I'll need resources, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Access to legal scholars, trade experts, medical professionals from both species. I'll need records of similar attempts, even failed ones, to understand what doesn't work. I'll need. You'll have whatever you need, the Queen interrupted. This test has the full backing of the throne. Money, personnel, authority, all at your disposal. But Marcus, her eyes found mine. You'll also have full responsibility. If this succeeds, you'll be celebrated. If it fails, you'll be blamed. Are you prepared for that? No, absolutely not. The idea of being responsible for either the salvation or damnation of vampire-human relations was terrifying beyond words. Yes, I said anyway. She smiled. Still honest? Good. Dishonesty at this stage would doom the entire project. She stood and the others rose with her. We'll depart for Thornhaven in 3 days. That gives you time to begin preliminary designs and gives me time to manage court politics. Lord Corvinus and Lady Sable are not pleased with this decision, but they've agreed not to actively sabotage it. That's the best we can hope for. What about the younger vampires? I asked. The ones who want expansion and creation of new vampires? They're being managed, Vincent said. We've promised them that if integration succeeds, it will include pathways for controlled transformation of willing humans. That satisfied some of them. Others remain opposed, but they lack the political power to stop the experiment. Yet, Lord Ashford added darkly, they lack power yet. If this test fails, they will use that failure as evidence that aggressive expansion is the only option. They will rally support, and we may face internal conflict that makes the blood wars look civilized. Then we won't fail, I said with more confidence than I felt. Spoken like someone who hasn't seen what failure looks like, Lord Ashford replied. But I appreciate the spirit. The meeting concluded shortly after with discussions of travel logistics and communication protocols. I would leave first, traveling back to Thornhaven by conventional means to prepare the human side, meeting with the city council, beginning to lay groundwork with the population. The vampire delegation would follow 3 days later, arriving publicly and ceremonially to emphasize that this was official and sanctioned. As the others left, the Queen gestured for me to remain. When we were alone, she moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. I'm frightened, Marcus, she said quietly. I haven't been truly frightened in 700 years, but I am now. What if I'm wrong? What if changing my mind was a mistake, and Lord Corvinus is correct that integration is impossible? Then we fail, I said. And we try something else. Being wrong isn't fatal. Refusing to admit you might be wrong, that's what's fatal. She turned to look at me. You're very wise for a clerk. I'm very ordinary for a clerk, I corrected. I'm just honest about what I don't know, which apparently looks like wisdom to people who can't admit ignorance. She laughed, and it was the sound of someone releasing tension they'd been holding for longer than I'd been alive. That's exactly what I needed to hear. She moved closer, and I was reminded again of how physically imposing she was, tall, powerful, radiating an authority that had nothing to do with her position and everything to do with her presence. The prophecy said you would sit beside me without guards, and in that vulnerability change would come, she said. It didn't say what form that change would take or whether it would succeed. It just said it would come. Are you sorry you fulfilled the prophecy? I asked. No, she said immediately. Even if this fails, even if integration proves impossible, I'm not sorry. Because for the first time in centuries I feel alive. Not just existing, not just continuing, but actually alive. Uncertain, yes. Frightened, yes. But also hopeful, and I'd forgotten what hope felt like. She reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was cold, not unpleasantly so, but noticeably different from human warmth. Thank you, Marcus Renfield. For your honesty. For your questions. For sitting beside me when anyone sensible would have run. Your Majesty, I said carefully, I didn't do anything remarkable. I just talked with you. You did the thing that no one else could do, she replied. You treated me as a person rather than as an icon or a monster. You saw past the power and the history and the fear, and you spoke to me as one conscious being to another. That is the foundation of everything we're trying to build. If we can't see each other as people, integration will fail before it begins. She stepped back, the moment of vulnerability passing as her queenly composure returned. Go. Prepare your city. And Marcus? Don't be surprised if you're met with resistance. Humans fear us with good reason, and asking them to welcome us into their homes will be challenging. I know, I said. But I also know that humans are adaptable. If we can show them a path that leads somewhere better than where we are now, some will take it. And sometimes that's all you need. A few people willing to try something new and others follow. Let us hope you're right, she said. For both our sakes. The journey back to Thornhaven felt both longer and shorter than the journey away from it. Longer because I knew what was waiting, the impossibly complex task of preparing an entire city for vampire integration. Shorter because I spent every moment drafting frameworks, making notes, trying to anticipate problems before they arose. The two escorts who'd brought me to the castle accompanied me back, but this time they spoke. They answered my questions about vampire culture, feeding practices, social structures. They were remarkably patient with my endless inquiries, and I began to understand that I'd been assigned these two specifically because they were good at dealing with curious humans. You'll find, one of them said, I'd learned his name was Thomas, that most vampires are nothing like the court elders. We're just people trying to get by, same as humans. The elders are concentrated. All their age and power and history makes them into something more and less than normal vampires. The queen is different, I observed. The queen is exceptional, the other escort, Catherine, agreed. She has all that age and power, but she hasn't let it compress her into rigidity the way it has the others. That's why she's queen. That's why she can actually lead rather than just rule. We reached Thornhaven as the sun was setting on the third day. The city looked exactly as I'd left it, small, prosperous in a modest way, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. I went directly to the council chambers, where the Lord Chairman was waiting. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the days I'd been gone. Marcus, he said standing when I entered. You're alive. We weren't certain you'd return. Neither was I, to be honest, I replied. But I did, and I've brought back something more significant than my survival. I spent the next 2 hours explaining everything. The prophecy, the conversation with the Queen, the decision to test integration, Thornhaven's selection as the pilot city. The Lord Chairman's expression progressed from relief to confusion to shock to something approaching panic. Marcus, he said when I'd finished, what you're describing it's unprecedented. It's revolutionary. It's necessary, I interrupted. The current system is failing. The buffer zones are shrinking. War is coming unless we find an alternative. This is that alternative. But vampires, living here, in Thornhaven, feeding on our citizens. With consent and compensation, I emphasized. This isn't predation. This is regulated cooperation. And yes, it's strange. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it requires us to completely rethink our relationship to vampires. But the alternative is worse. He sat heavily in his chair. The council will need to vote on this. The council will approve it, I said with certainty I didn't feel. Because the alternative is being invaded when the treaties collapse. At least this way we have agency. We have control. We get to shape what integration looks like rather than having it forced on us. You've changed, he observed. A week ago you were a quiet clerk who never spoke in meetings. Now you're talking about revolutionizing human-vampire relations. A week ago I'd never sat with a vampire queen and changed her mind, I replied. Perspectives shift. The council meeting was scheduled for 2 days later, which gave me time to prepare presentations, draft preliminary frameworks, and begin quiet conversations with key stakeholders. I met with merchants who traded in the border zones and had experience with vampires. I met with medical professionals to discuss blood donation protocols. I met with legal scholars to explore jurisdiction questions. And I met with ordinary citizens, the poor, the desperate, the curious, to gauge their potential willingness to volunteer for the blood donation program. The reactions were mixed. Some were horrified. Some were intrigued. A surprising number were pragmatic. How much does it pay? Was the most common question, followed by, how often? And is it dangerous? I drafted answers. I created documentation. I built the framework that would either save or doom both species. The council meeting was contentious. Half the council wanted to reject the proposal outright, calling it suicide or collaboration with monsters. The other half could see the pragmatic necessity, even if they didn't like it. The Lord Chairman, to his credit, supported it. Thornhaven has always been a practical city, he said during the debate. We don't chase glory or grandeur. We survive, we prosper modestly, and we adapt to changing circumstances. The circumstances are changing. War is coming unless we do something unprecedented. So let's be unprecedented. The vote was close. 7 in favor, 5 against, 3 abstaining. But it passed. Thornhaven would become the first integrated human vampire city in history. The next 3 days were chaos. We established the district where vampires would live, the old merchant quarter as I'd suggested. We renovated buildings, established boundaries, created documentation for everything from housing contracts to feeding schedules to legal protocols. And we recruited volunteers. The first blood donation center was set up in a former guild hall. We hired medical staff, established strict health and safety protocols, and set compensation rates that were generous enough to attract volunteers but not so high that we'd bankrupt the city. On the first day of recruitment, I honestly didn't know if anyone would show up. 23 people came. 23 humans willing to try something that had never been tried before, willing to sell their blood to vampires for the sake of an experiment that might fail catastrophically. I interviewed each of them personally. A widow who needed money to keep her house. A student who wanted to fund his education. A young woman who was simply curious about vampires and saw this as a safe way to interact with them. An older man who'd served in the military during the tail end of the blood wars and wanted to be part of ending the cycle of violence. Each had their reasons. Each was brave in ways they probably didn't recognize. And then, on the day the vampires were scheduled to arrive, Thornhaven held its breath. They came at sunset as symbolically appropriate. The entire city had gathered, or at least it felt like the entire city. Thousands of people lining the main street from the city gates to the merchant quarter, watching in silence as the vampire delegation arrived. The queen came first, riding in an open carriage because she wanted to be seen. She wore not her throne room finery but something simpler, a dark traveling dress that was elegant without being intimidating. She looked regal, yes, but also approachable. Human, almost, if you could ignore the slight glow of her skin and the way her presence seemed to command attention without effort. Behind her came the others, Lord Ashford, Lady Miriam, Vincent, Elena, and 15 more vampires selected for this first wave. All dressed formally but not threateningly. All clearly nervous, though they hid it better than humans would. I stood at the entrance to the merchant quarter, officially representing the human side of the welcome. My legs were shaking, but I kept my face neutral. The queen's carriage stopped in front of me, and she descended with fluid grace. We'd rehearsed this moment, the first formal interaction between species in an integrated context. Your Majesty, I said, bowing slightly. Thornhaven welcomes you and your delegation. We offer you sanctuary, cooperation, and the hope of a shared future. Marcus Renfield, she replied, and I'd forgotten how powerful her voice was in person. On behalf of the Court of Night, I thank you and Thornhaven for your courage in attempting what has never been attempted. We come not as conquerors or guests, but as partners in an uncertain endeavor. It was choreographed, yes. Formal words for a formal occasion. But beneath the protocol there was genuine weight. This was happening. Actually happening. The crowd was silent, watching. I could feel their fear, their uncertainty, their desperate hope that this wouldn't be a disaster. I turned to the assembled humans. Citizens of Thornhaven, I called out, my voice carrying in the evening air. These vampires come in peace, sanctioned by both their queen and our council. They will live in the designated district, abide by our laws and their own, and participate in the systems we've established for coexistence. This is an experiment, an attempt to find a path forward that doesn't lead to war. I ask you to give them the same chance you'd give any newcomers to our city. Respect, caution, and willingness to see how this unfolds. Not everyone looked convinced, but enough nodded, enough seemed willing to try that I felt a flutter of hope. The Queen and her delegation moved into the merchant quarter. We'd prepared housing for them, entire buildings renovated and furnished. They would live together initially, creating a vampire enclave within the city, but the goal was gradual integration as trust built. That first night, nothing dramatic happened. The vampires settled into their new homes. A few curious humans walked past the district, looking but not approaching. The volunteer blood donors were scheduled to begin the next day. I barely slept, expecting. I don't know what. Violence? Riots? Something catastrophic to prove the skeptics right. Instead, morning came peacefully. The city woke and the vampires slept and the world kept turning. The first donation session was scheduled for noon. I was there personally, as was Lady Miriam, who would be receiving the donation. The volunteer was Clara, the young woman who'd said she was curious about vampires. She was nervous, clearly, but determined. Lady Miriam was the picture of professionalism, medical precision mixed with genuine care for Clara's comfort. This will feel strange, Miriam said as Clara sat in the donation chair. Not painful exactly, but unusual. I'll take only what's medically safe, about the same amount as a standard medical donation. You'll feel tired afterward. You should rest, drink fluids, eat something with iron. Clara nodded, her jaw set. Miriam fed. Not dramatically, not like the sensationalized versions in old stories. She simply bent close to Clara's neck, and after a moment Clara's eyes widened slightly. Oh, she said softly. That's weird. But not bad. 3 minutes later it was done. Miriam stepped back and Clara sat there looking surprised. That's it. That's it, Miriam confirmed. You were very brave. Thank you for trusting me. Clara touched her neck. There were 2 small marks, already healing with preternatural speed thanks to something in vampire saliva that promoted coagulation. Ha, she said. That wasn't as scary as I thought. She was paid, given post-donation care instructions, and sent home with a follow-up appointment scheduled for a month later. 1 donation, successful and unremarkable. By the end of the first week, we'd completed 12 donations with no incidents. The volunteer list had grown to 35. Vampires were being seen in the streets during evening hours, shopping in markets, attending cultural events. There were awkward moments, yes, humans who refused to interact, vampires who struggled with casual socializing, but no violence, no disasters. By the end of the first month, something extraordinary was happening. Humans and vampires were talking to each other. I watched it in the Central Market one evening. Vincent, the vampire trade negotiator, was discussing fabric quality with a human merchant, both of them completely absorbed in the conversation. 2 young vampires were attending a street performance with a mixed crowd, laughing at the same jokes as the humans. Elena had started teaching evening classes on vampire history, and humans were attending out of genuine curiosity. It was working. Not perfectly. There were incidents. A vampire who forgot human social norms and frightened someone, a human who hurled insults and had to be escorted away by city guards, tensions around feeding schedules and district boundaries. But these were solvable problems, not fundamental incompatibilities. Lord Ashford, the skeptic who'd predicted failure, cornered me in the second month. I was wrong, he said simply. I didn't think this could work, but you're proving me wrong. How? Systems, I said. And honesty. We built clear systems that both sides understand. And we were honest about the challenges rather than pretending they didn't exist. People can handle difficult things if they know what to expect and feel like they have agency in the process. You're wasted as a clerk, he said. You should be advising queens. I am advising a queen, I pointed out. I'm just doing it from Thornhaven instead of her castle. The queen visited monthly, always publicly, always taking time to meet with both vampires and humans. She attended city council meetings, which scandalized some and fascinated others. She ate dinner at human restaurants, not eating but sitting and conversing while humans around her did. She made herself present, visible, approachable. And slowly, fear was being replaced by familiarity. By the 6th month we had expanded the program. 50 vampires now lived in Thornhaven. The blood donation volunteer list exceeded 300. We'd established joint human-vampire patrols of the city guard. Vampire craftsmen were teaching their techniques to human apprentices. Human scholars were accessing vampire archives of historical knowledge. It was working. But I knew, and the Queen knew, and everyone paying attention knew, this was still the easy part. We were in a controlled environment with carefully selected participants, with the full backing of both human and vampire authorities. The real test would come when we tried to scale this up. When we tried to implement integration in other cities with different populations with less ideal circumstances. And there were those who didn't want it to succeed. The attack came in the 8th month, and it came from both sides simultaneously. A group of young vampires, frustrated with what they saw as submission to human authority, attempted to feed outside the donation system. They targeted a human merchant traveling alone at night, intending to take blood by force. At the same time, a group of human extremists attempted to set fire to one of the vampire residential buildings, believing the entire integration project was a prelude to human enslavement. Both groups were stopped. The vampires by Elena and other integrated vampires who'd been monitoring the radicals, the humans by the joint city guard patrols. But the damage was done. Trust had been fractured. Emergency council was called, both the human city council and the vampire delegation leadership. I sat in that meeting listening to accusations fly back and forth. This proves integration is impossible, one human counselor shouted. They're predators. They can't help themselves. Your humans tried to murder us while we slept, Lord Ashford countered coldly. Don't lecture us about control. The Queen, attending via magical communication device that projected her image into the council chamber, let them argue for a full hour. Then she spoke and her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Enough. Silence fell. Both sides have failed, she said. Both sides have radicals who want this to fail, who cannot imagine a world different from the one they know. This was always going to happen. The question is what we do next. We punish those responsible, I said, standing. Severely. Publicly. We make it clear that these actions are unacceptable under the integration framework. The vampires who attempted predation should be expelled from Thornhaven and censured by your court. The humans who attempted arson should face full criminal charges under our law. That will make martyrs of them, someone objected. Perhaps, I agreed. But it will also establish that this experiment has teeth. That we're serious about making it work, and those who sabotage it will face consequences. The Queen nodded slowly. Marcus is correct. We cannot let this pass without response or it will embolden others. The vampires involved will be recalled to my court and dealt with under our laws. I trust Thornhaven will handle its own extremists similarly. The vote was unanimous. Justice would be swift and public. But I knew it wasn't enough. We'd stopped this incident, but the underlying tensions remained. Integration was working for those who wanted it to work, but there were significant populations on both sides who remained opposed. I spent the night drafting a proposal. Something that would give the opposition a voice, a pathway to air grievances that didn't involve violence. By dawn I had a framework. A joint committee, I explained to the Queen when she arrived in Thornhaven 2 days later. Made up of both supporters and opponents of integration. They meet regularly, discuss concerns, propose modifications to the system. Give the opposition legitimate political power rather than forcing them into extremism. You want to give power to those who oppose the very thing we're trying to build? Lord Ashford asked incredulously. I want to give them a voice, I corrected. Because they have legitimate concerns. Not all opposition is irrational hatred. Some of it is genuine worry about safety, culture, autonomy. If we ignore those concerns, they fester. If we address them, even if we can't solve them all, we at least demonstrate that we're listening. This is very human thinking, Lady Miriam observed. Yes, I agreed. Because humans are good at messy compromise. We're good at creating systems where everyone is a little unhappy but no one is desperate. That's democracy, organized dissatisfaction that prevents violent revolution. The committee was established within the week. It was contentious, frustrating, and absolutely necessary. Opponents of integration got to voice their concerns directly to the Queen and city leadership. Some of their concerns led to policy modifications. We established stricter boundaries for vampire districts in evening hours, created better education programs about vampire nature for humans, implemented more rigorous screening for blood donation volunteers. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. And functionality, I was learning, was often better than perfection. The incident had actually strengthened the integration in an unexpected way. The fact that both sides had faced extremism, and both sides had worked together to stop it, created a sense of shared experience. The joint city guard patrols became more cohesive. The volunteer donation program expanded as humans saw that vampires who broke the rules faced real consequences. By the end of the first year, Thornhaven had achieved something remarkable. It wasn't paradise. It wasn't seamless coexistence. But it was functional integration, two species living in the same space, following shared rules, working toward common goals. And other cities were watching. The Queen summoned me back to her castle for the 1-year assessment. The throne room was filled again, but the atmosphere was different than my first visit. Less hostile, more curious. The test has succeeded, the Queen announced to her assembled court. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. Thornhaven has demonstrated that vampire-human integration is possible. The Oversight Committee has recommended we expand the program to 3 additional cities, with lessons learned from Thornhaven incorporated into the frameworks. Lord Corvinus stood. He looked older, somehow, though vampires didn't age. Or perhaps he just looked defeated. Your Majesty, he said quietly, I have opposed this integration from the beginning. I believed it was submission, weakness, surrender of what we are. I was wrong. The court rippled with shock. I visited Thornhaven, he continued. I spoke with the integrated vampires. I observed the blood donation system, the joint patrols, the cultural exchanges. And I realized that what I was seeing was not submission. It was evolution. We are not becoming less than we were. We are becoming more. We are gaining access to human adaptability, human innovation, human flexibility, all while maintaining our essential nature. He turned to look at me. The human was right. Predation is not biological necessity. It is cultural habit. And we can change our habits while remaining ourselves. Another elder stood. I concur. The expansion should proceed. Another. Agreed. One by one the opposition crumbled. Not all of it, there were still holdouts, still those who would never accept integration. But enough shifted that the momentum became unstoppable. The Queen met with me privately afterward. You did it, she said simply. You changed not just my mind but the minds of those who've been frozen for centuries longer than I have. I didn't do it, I corrected. Thornhaven did it. All those volunteers, all those vampires willing to try something new, all those ordinary people choosing courage over fear, they did it. You built the system that let them do it, she replied. You created the framework that turned individual courage into collective success. Don't diminish that. She walked to the window of her study, looking out over her castle grounds. The prophecy was right. A human sitting with me without guards, and in that vulnerability, a new path became visible. But the prophecy didn't mention what would happen after. What comes next, Marcus? Next. I looked at her. Next we scale up. We implement integration in more cities. We refine the systems. We document what works and what doesn't. We train more people in both species to manage integration. We write laws and treaties and frameworks. We do the boring, tedious work of turning a revolutionary idea into mundane reality. And you'll oversee this? Me? I laughed. I'm a clerk from Thornhaven. I'm not qualified to oversee continental transformation. You're the human who changed the mind of a vampire queen, she said. You're the architect of the first successful integration. You're exactly qualified. She turned to face me. I'm establishing a new position, coordinator of integration. Technically advisory to both vampire and human authorities, actually autonomous with resources and authority to implement the integration framework across territories. The position is yours if you want it. I stood there stunned. A year ago I'd been counting coins and filing paperwork. Now I was being offered a role that would reshape the political structure of the continent. Can I think about it? I asked. No, she said, smiling. Because you'll overthink it and find 1,000 reasons to say no. So I need you to answer from instinct rather than analysis. Do you want to do this? Did I? The role would be impossibly difficult, politically fraught, personally exhausting. I'd be mediating between species for the rest of my life, managing crises, building systems, disappointing people in both populations who wanted more than was possible. Yes, I said. I want to do this. Good. Then it's done. She extended her hand and I took it. Her grip was cool and firm, the handshake of equals agreeing to partnership. One condition, I said. You have to keep sitting with me. No guards. Regular meetings where we're just two people talking honestly about problems. Because the moment we stop being able to do that, the moment we hide behind protocol and formality, this whole thing falls apart. She considered, then nodded. Agreed. We'll meet monthly in spaces without guards or witnesses. We'll maintain the vulnerability that made this possible. She smiled. You're going to irritate me frequently, aren't you? Absolutely, I confirmed. It's part of the job description. The small cafe in Thornhaven was busy as it usually was these evenings. Mixed crowds, human and vampire, sat at tables conversing, laughing, arguing about art and politics and sports. The owner, a human woman named Sarah, employed both species and didn't differentiate in her brusque service. I sat at my usual corner table reviewing reports. 14 cities now had integration programs. The protocols had been refined, expanded, improved. We'd faced challenges. Some cities struggled more than others, there had been setbacks and failures, but the overall trend was clear. Integration was becoming normalized. Elena slid into the seat across from me. She'd become one of my key assistants, managing the vampire side of coordination while I handled the human side. "You look exhausted," she observed. "I am exhausted," I confirmed. "The North March implementation is having issues. The local human government is resisting parts of the framework." "Of course they are. North March has always been difficult." She signaled Sarah for 2 drinks, coffee for me, something dark that probably wasn't coffee for her. But we knew this would be messy. Revolutionary changes usually are. "It's not revolutionary anymore," I said. "That's what's strange. Somewhere along the way this became normal. Humans and vampires living together isn't shocking, it's just Tuesday." She smiled. "That was always the goal, wasn't it? To make the extraordinary ordinary." The Queen arrived without fanfare as she usually did these days. She wore simple traveling clothes and moved through the cafe without drawing much attention beyond a few respectful nods. She sat at our table and Sarah brought her a drink without asking what she wanted. They'd established a rapport over the years. "Monthly meeting," the Queen said. "No guards, no formality, just us. How are you, Marcus?" "Tired," I said. "You?" "The same. The court is still adjusting to the changes. Some of the older vampires will never fully accept integration, but they've stopped actively opposing it." She sipped her drink. "I've been thinking about the prophecy lately." "What about it?" I asked. "It said a human would sit with me and in that vulnerability change would come. But it never said what kind of change or how much or whether it would last." She looked around the cafe at the mixed crowd existing peacefully. "Do you think this is what it meant? This gradual transformation of how our species interact?" "I think prophecies are vague for a reason," I said. "They give you direction without dictating destination. You sat with me, yes. But then we did the work. We built the systems. We made the change real through effort, not magic." "Very pragmatic," she said, smiling. "I'm a clerk," I replied. "Pragmatism is what we do." Elena laughed. "You're not a clerk anymore, Marcus. You're the coordinator of integration. You're probably one of the most powerful humans on the continent." "I file paperwork about vampire-human cooperation instead of grain tariffs," I said. "Still feels like clerking to me." The Queen reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for sitting with me that first night. For being honest when everyone else was performing. For building something real from a vague prophecy and mutual desperation." "Thank you for taking the risk," I replied. "For changing your mind when centuries of experience said you couldn't. For trusting a nobody clerk from a nowhere city." "You were never a nobody," she said. "You were exactly who we needed. You just didn't know it yet." We sat there, the 3 of us, in a cafe in Thornhaven where humans and vampires shared space without fear or dominance. Outside, the city continued its evening routines. Mixed patrols walking the streets, mixed markets selling goods, mixed crowds attending entertainments. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still problems, still people on both sides who hated what we'd built. But it was working. And that was enough. I thought back to that first night, walking into the throne room of the Vampire Queen, terrified and confused and completely out of my depth. I'd stood before her not because I was brave but because I didn't know what else to do. And in that moment of honest ignorance, something had shifted. She'd been looking for someone who could see vampires as they truly were. Not monsters, not myths, but people frozen in patterns they couldn't break alone. And I'd looked at her and seen not a terrifying supernatural predator, but someone exhausted from carrying impossible weight for centuries. 2 people, separated by biology and history and power, finding common ground in simple honesty. That was what the prophecy had really meant. Not that one special human would solve everything, but that genuine connection between species was possible if you stripped away the pretense and performance. If you sat together without guards, without protocols, without all the structures designed to maintain distance. Vulnerability as the foundation for change. What are you thinking about? The Queen asked. How a clerk's greatest skill, honest admission of ignorance, turned out to be exactly what was needed to change the world, I said. She smiled. The world does have a sense of irony. Or a sense of justice, Elena suggested. Maybe the world needed someone ordinary to prove that extraordinary things don't require extraordinary people. Just ordinary people willing to try something new. Deep thoughts for a Tuesday evening, I said, finishing my coffee. It's what we do at these meetings, the Queen replied. Talk about deep things in ordinary settings. It keeps us grounded. We sat a while longer talking about nothing important. Upcoming city events, complaints about bureaucracy, gossip about various officials both human and vampire who were making our jobs difficult. Normal conversation between people who'd become friends through shared impossible work. Eventually the Queen rose to leave. Same time next month? She asked. Same time next month, I confirmed. She walked out into the Thornhaven evening, and the cafe continued around us. 5 years ago, a vampire queen walking through a human city would have caused panic. Now it barely warranted a glance. That was the real revolution. Not the grand political changes or the formal treaties or the elaborate systems of governance. It was this, the gradual normalization of what was once unthinkable. The slow transformation of fear into familiarity, of otherness into merely difference. Elena and I stayed to finish our drinks and review a few more reports. Around us, Thornhaven lived its integrated life. Messy, complicated, imperfect and real. You know, Elena said thoughtfully, when this started everyone expected it to be dramatic. A grand clash of civilizations, either glorious success or catastrophic failure. And instead it was bureaucracy, I said. And instead it was bureaucracy, she agreed. Endless meetings, forms to fill out, systems to refine, problems to solve one at a time. Not the stuff of prophecies and legends. But it worked, I pointed out. But it worked, she echoed. Because you understood that real change isn't dramatic. It's incremental. It's 1,000 small decisions that add up to transformation. I looked around the cafe again, at humans and vampires sharing space, sharing conversations, sharing existence. The vampire queen sat beside me without guards, I said quietly. And that changed everything. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But completely. Do you ever regret it? Elena asked. You could have had a simple life. Clerk's work, quiet retirement, nothing more challenging than tax calculations. Every day, I admitted. This work is exhausting, frustrating, and will probably consume the rest of my life. I smiled. But I also wouldn't trade it. Because I got to be part of something that matters. I got to help build a world where prophesied impossibilities become Tuesday evenings in cafes. We finished our drinks and stepped out into Thornhaven night. The city stretched around us. Lights in windows both human and vampire, sounds of mixed populations living their lives, the quiet hum of a society learning to exist in new configurations. 5 years ago, I'd been a nobody clerk in a nothing city, and my biggest concern was whether I'd get a raise. Now I was the architect of integration, coordinator of transformation, the human who'd sat with a vampire queen and changed her mind. But mostly I was still just Marcus. Still figuring things out as I went, still admitting ignorance more often than claiming wisdom, still approaching each new challenge with the same basic strategy. Honesty, systematic thinking, and a willingness to try. It had been enough before. It would be enough going forward. The prophecy had spoken of a human who would sit with the queen without guards, and in that vulnerability create change. What it hadn't mentioned was that the change would be ongoing. That sitting together, really sitting together without protection or pretense, was not a single event but a practice. Something you did again and again in throne rooms and cafes, in formal meetings and casual conversations. The vulnerability wasn't the catalyst. It was the foundation. And on that foundation humans and vampires were building something that had never existed before. Not dominance. Not submission. Not even simple coexistence. Partnership. Messy, complicated, imperfect, and absolutely worth it. I walked home through streets where vampires and humans passed each other without fear, where the night held possibility rather than danger, where the future was being written in bureaucratic reports and cafe conversations. And I thought that if prophecies could see me now, the ordinary clerk who'd become extraordinary by remaining determinately ordinary, they might be satisfied. Or they might have another impossible task waiting. Either way, I'd face it the same way I'd faced everything else. Honestly, systematically, and with a willingness to admit I had no idea what I was doing. It had worked once. It would probably work again. And in the meantime there was work to do. Reports to file, meetings to attend, systems to refine, and a world to transform one small decision at a time. Just another day in the life of the human who sat beside a vampire queen and changed everything.